So I fell behind quite badly with a lot of reviews last year of things that I really did intend to review, but just carried on reading. And as a result, I have a lot of things just sort of stored up in my head that I kind of wanted to put down into some proper analysis and put on Goodreads, but at the moment I have such a backlog and trying to keep up with my reading challenges this year. It's been a bit of a challenge, so I thought I'd just do a quick blast on 10 of the books from last year. Some of them hopefully eventually will have proper reviews, others probably won't, but I just thought I would get this one group together because I really do need to sort of say something about some of them before I can go on and focus on some other things. So at number 10, have The Mist in the Mirror by Susan Hill, which is quite an old ghost story. I think it's from the early 90s, but it is after Woman in Black. And it was sat on my shelf for a very long time, and it was one I was always meaning to read and just never seemed to quite get round to it. And it's probably not the best Susan Hill ghost story ever written. It certainly wasn't as good as The Woman in Black. However, it was a really good reading experience because I just flipped through it in a few days and it did have me hooked. It had a few very, very memorable ghost story set pieces and partly set sort of in a school, very M.R. James. But what's really great about this, which isn't quite as strong in The Woman in Black, but I think really came into her later work, was this focuses very much on the idea of a person being haunted rather than necessarily a place. And it comes up quite a bit in sort of the later Susan Hill stories, especially I'm thinking like The Small Hand, but actually also in some of her other fiction that she wrote, her just sort of short stories that weren't supernatural, paranormal, things like The Beacon. The idea of sort of troubled people and people being haunted, whether by something supernatural or whether just by life and by experience. So that was number 10, and yeah, brilliant short ghost story. Just does what it says if you're into ghost stories. And number 9, it's a little bit of a cheat because I actually only finished this year, so it's actually part of my current reading challenge. But I did start it right at the end of last year, and I was reading it over Christmas, so I tend to associate it with last year. And that's The Writer's War, the World War I in the words of the great writers who experienced it. So obviously it's a group effort, not just one author. But what is fantastic about this is I actually didn't intend to do any World War I stuff this year at all, because a few years ago I think there was just such a deluge of World War I sort of TV and even things that weren't necessarily about World War One. Suddenly that's where they ended up, and I imagine we'll still be getting bits of it throughout this 4 years for obvious reasons. But what was fantastic about this was, rather than focusing on one experience and one overall picture of the war, which is something that I think everybody already has their own preconceived notion of what a World War One story is anyway, this took lots of different extracts, lots of poetry, extracts of stories, of longer novels, of short stories, as well as diary entries, reports, and yeah, just memoirs, a lot of people that I hadn't actually heard of, and they come from all over, so not just soldiers, but nurses, people on the home front, farmers. There's one particular short story that I think was intended to be humorous. It didn't come across as humorous, but I think that's because it hasn't aged well. But it did give a good flavour, because you just don't expect to have a funny story in a World War One anthology. But it was quite dark in a way and quite farcical. But it spans from before 1914 and some writings of the time that were clearly in this looking towards, some people had captured the idea that there was this war in the air talk, all the way through 1914, 15, 16, and then up to the end of the war. The way that the poetry is used in particular is really good, because it helps to break up the chunks from other novels. The part about it that was kind of annoying was that quite often I did get into one of them and then it would stop, and so it sort of sparked up a whole other separate reading list just based on this. But it was definitely an experience. It took a lot longer than I expected, and yeah, if you're still going for sort of the World War One thing, actually I think this is a good overall representation. Also, it is still mainly very Western and Allied, but still, yeah, goes into some places and into some people that I wouldn't have expected them to feature. So, and Number 3, hopefully this will have a proper review soon, because it's taking a very long time. But this is The Petticoat Men by Barbara Ewing, and it's based on a true story of Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton, who were two cross-dressers in Victorian London and ended up being quite a scandal. I actually encountered them in another book that's going to be on this little list, which was a factual book. And it's quite a strange relationship, this book that I have with it. There's a lot of things I actually don't like about it, but a lot of the things that I do, I really do like, which is probably why the review is just taking ridiculously long. But the main thing about this is that it was just such a fantastically interesting story of two real people who we've completely forgotten about, and at the time must have been such a massive scandal. So it's just, I find it interesting how we don't remember certain things, and yet certain things we do that actually aren't that important, or that, they're very atypical. But this as well, I mean, it's an interesting maybe sort of movement in sort of the whole LGBT literature, because although it's not really representative of what we would think about today, it does just show how attitudes were at a certain time, and it's quite hard to pin down actually what was going on with these two, where their relationship was, what their relationship was to other people who were very well known. So yeah, it would actually make a fantastic TV series. I imagine it being very much like Ripper Street, but yeah. And then Terror and Wonder, the Gothic Imagination. So in January of 2015, I think it's the end of 2014, and it went on to beginning of 2015. The British Library did an amazing exhibition called Terror and Wonder, all about everything to do with Gothic, and it was as if someone had just sort of drilled into my head and released everything inside my brain, which doesn't sound very romantic, but to me that is a very romantic thought. And being someone who's been in love with anything to do with horror and Gothic and anything to do with fear and the night and anything that focuses on the idea of the other, this is sort of just a massive celebration. And if you read the text, it actually goes all the way back to the origins of the word Gothic, which can be a little, you have to really kind of want to delve that deeply, but it's worth it sometimes, because ideas that are sort of quite half-formed actually do turn out to be true when you look directly back to the sources. Because Gothic actually really only meant unclassical, really, and from that it then developed into what we take as to be the other. And the one thing that you really learn from this is that an interest in violence or in horror or in challenging things that are not considered classic or are not considered, worthy, that are maybe considered more barbaric, is nothing new. It's been going on for a long time. And also where the word boo comes from. And then found myself on very familiar grounds with Victorian city, everyday life in Dickens's London. If you are interested at all in history and in writing history, if you're writing about Victorian London, then this is a book that you need to read. It really does go into clinical detail. So a lot of the negative reviews, I think, were kind of reflective of that I did come across. But for me, even though I will admit there were a few moments where I possibly couldn't quite keep up into the detail, it was just such an overall fantastic picture. And although it does refer to a lot of Dickens' stories, I think that's only one half of it. It is very much a biography of a city, which it's a city I love, so of course. But it's really the history of London, in a way, is a social history of a modern country. And you can there's so many areas that you could have investigated, but I find it interesting the ones that she chose. So things like parks, things like the pavement, and then this last chapter, which was entirely on prostitution, the fact that she chose to look at male prostitution, which is an area which just isn't anywhere near researched or explored enough, I think, at all, especially since we do seem to be fascinated by anything to do with sexuality and immorality and vice. But this was also where the story of Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton first occurred to my mind. So yeah, Judith Flanders, Very well known, I think, very well respected sort of historian when it comes to these kind of things in social history. So I have another of hers to read, which may be this year, may now be next year. The reading list is kind of growing in my head. And then The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher by Kate Summerscale, which this is a very delayed read because I do remember when it was originally out, I remember all the hype about it, and I remember the TV show. I did put off watching the TV show until I'd read. But one of the reasons I didn't want to read it at the time was I'm always very sceptical about reading a book when there is so much hype around it, because I want to be able to view it objectively if I can. I want to be able to look at it for my own reasons. I don't want to feel sort of pressured into liking it, if that makes sense. I don't want to feel that I have to go with consensus, or that if I do like it, that I'm just liking it for the sake of liking it. I want to actually know why I came to it. And really, it could have been written for me. It's just, it started off a huge fascination now with period true crime, which culminated in my little visit to the Black Museum. Very good. But The Murder at Road Hill House was the story of a particularly nasty murder. It was a child, so not very nice to read about, but really it's just a terribly sad story about a family that just imploded in on itself somehow. And obviously at the time, that stuff wasn't talked about, and the family was considered so sacred that actually it did more damage, really, because you couldn't talk about things that weren't quite right within families. And although there was, I think, one person to blame, I think there are actually two people to blame directly. Almost every person in this you could kind of draw a bit of blame from. But it's also fascinating in terms of how it depicts the development of the police, of the idea of the detective, and how that idea of the detective really gave birth to our modern idea of the police and detective, and it's applied detective a lot in a very short space of time. But our modern idea of the detective story, how Witcher actually became the blueprint for just so many fictional characters. And also introduced me to Constance Kent, who I think no one will ever get to the bottom of her. She's pretty scary and also pretty tragic. It's very well done. It deserved all the hype it got. The Fabled Coast by, I've completely forgotten the two women's names, Sophia Kingshill and Jennifer Westwood. And another one which I feel like could have been directly written just for me, because it plays into everything that I love to do with myths and legends, and also to do with the sea, to do with history, to do with ideas of sort of paranormal. And I love that this was written by two women, because a lot of the mythology books that I grew up with were always written by men. And what is particularly amazing about this book is that, firstly, that it focuses just on the coastline. So you already know that there are certain things that are going to be omitted, and that's okay, because I always feel when I read a mythology book, oh, my favourite little urban legend hasn't made it in here, and if this was included, why wasn't this? By just focusing on the idea of what is around the edge, it already kind of takes care of that. But I've come across a lot recently of sort of either mythology books written from a very scientific point of view, sometimes deliberately trying to debunk, other times just trying to look at it from that detached scientific point of view, which is fine, because I don't actually believe in any of these myths and legends. But I think when you're trying to actually show their value in terms of storytelling and their value in terms of social history, you kind of need to just get that across. Because we all know that this isn't real. We all know that they're not really monsters or ghosts. So we all know that there probably it's something very boring, or it's just something we've come up with, and it just doesn't lend itself to that reading experience, So, but then on the other hand, it's all too common to come across a mythology book written by somebody who clearly believes in some form of spirituality, and they're trying very hard, or maybe they're not trying hard, but they're just speaking from that point of view, speaking from their own beliefs, and not, giving credence to the fact that actually these things are all just stories, the point, I think, really for a mythology or a compendium of any kind of legends is to actually look at that idea of storytelling, where these stories come from, why they were such an important part of us and our heritage, why we continue in our own way to make them. Definitely one for the mythology buffs. And then down onto the top three, got Alison Weir, The Princes in the Tower, another one that I should have read much sooner. I've actually not read any of her historical fiction, and I don't really want to. I think just because, having read so much her historical non-fiction, I don't really feel the need. I feel like the storytelling in these alone is enough. And there was a lot of Richard III around last year. Couldn't really get away from the guy. Well, if you're into your history, you couldn't. And I thought, well, it would be a good time to actually go back and read this. And what's interesting is that because it was written quite a while ago, obviously he hadn't been found. And so there's a little bit of, she's writing from, we know kind of more than her on that respect. But it's got less of the Richard mania that's kind of popped up recently, because I am a 100% believer that Richard III was to blame for the murder of the Princess in the Tower. And there are plenty of people who disagree, which is fine. But I think what's really behind that is two things. Firstly, it is we have to like the bad boy. We're all guilty of it. And secondly, it's the fact that we want to believe in a conspiracy theory, which is much bigger and more ridiculous than the simple fact of a man wanted something, some things were in his way, he took them out of the way. And this book really gets to the heart of that. It examines the events that took place across the whole of Richard's sort of brief role as protector, his reign, the reign of Edward IV, and the reign of Edward V, and the time which he and Richard, the younger Richard of York, would have been imprisoned together. And it really, once you have this objective, studied view of history, you do tend to see that it is often the most boring and straightforward. But that's not actually that boring. And what it does do is keep to the fact that, Richard III wasn't a good man, wasn't necessarily the monster that we're all very keen now to make sure that we know he's not, but that he was just a man of his time. And that this actually, as brutal and horrible as it was not that different from what anybody else was doing, really. And so we can't really put our own standard on it. But at the same time, we can't try and exonerate him in, a romantic, modern way. All you have to do is look at the facts. And this is a very, very well-studied factual account. She does name her sources. She talks about the weaknesses. She talks about the role of a historian in looking for these things. You just can't really fault her fact-finding. Obviously, you're never going to get there beyond reasonable doubt, but I think this is a very good case for prosecution, and it's an amazing read. So whatever side of the debate you're on, you need to have read this. It may not change your mind, but, there's things in here which you just can't ignore. And then Jennifer Donnelly, A Gathering Light. It was originally Northern Light, but the whole name changes. Yeah. Best fiction that I read, I think, last year, out of all the fiction. What was kind of difficult for me coming to this, because I first saw this when I was about 13, and it is a young adult book. And I normally don't like young adult books. Obviously I did then, but I don't really tend to read a lot of them as an adult, because I just find I can't go back to that now. And I do find quite often when young adult work proclaims to be for adults as well, it just falls short for me. But this was fantastic, and what was amazing about it was the fact that I really don't think she was trying to reach other people and to make it something that was a massive crossover. And for a young adult book, it really did avoid falling into a lot of wish fulfillment. It's some really horrible, brutal things happen in this book, and they're told quite plainly. The main character, she's not totally original, I feel, but her situation is the location, the sense of place, and she's the bibliography in the back, the fact that she published a bibliography. I love it when authors do that, because I think, especially if it's historical, you should quote where you got that historical knowledge from, because it does just underpin so much of historical writing. Is even if you do diverge from the path of truth, you still have that overall truth, and you can see where you diverged and why. And just from the fiction point of view, the fact that, not everything was going to work out, and you kind of knew that halfway through. I was really worried that there might be just an absolute happy ending. This book at the end, where it leaves our main character, we have her story mainly tied up, but we know it left a lot of shit in its wake for other characters. This wasn't going to be an all around everybody got their happy ending. So yeah, and the fact that it was again based on a real life murder, seemed to have spent a lot of time dabbling in the company of murderers this year. But yeah, and one I'd never heard of. It did, but it wasn't the main focus of the book. I felt it just sort of underpinned it. So this was fantastic, and I'm definitely looking out for more of hers now. Although I think I am sticking very much to the historical, not the fantasy, but definitely worth a very long wait to read. And the highlight from 2015 for me this year was The Last Expedition by, I've just forgotten the order of his name, but Scott of the Antarctic. Robert Falcon Scott. There we go. So obviously reading this, you know what's going to happen. Nobody now reading this is, well, even if you didn't know the story already, if you've got a cover with footprints disappearing, you know that's not going to be good. But I wanted to read this after, again, a visit to the British Library, and I saw Scott's journals, which were recovered from the tent where his final companions died, and saw his last letters, his really horrible, spiky writing, and just came in, it felt like I'd come in at the end of a story, and then I had to see the beginning. So I hunted and hunted for a good copy of his journals, because I know there have been so many books about him, but I wanted the actual sort of story as it unfolded. And I've read so many historical kind of books that are based on a found journal, some kind of disaster, and this is it, really. This is where it all comes from. I don't know whether anybody's written a fictitious account. I'm sure that it must have inspired some. It was just heartbreaking, and it was a whole journey. A tip if you're going to read it is to make sure the heating's on. But even from the beginning, and what really struck me was the fact what a really good writer Scott was, and his passion for everything that he wanted to do just spilled into it, and you really feel the frustration, you feel the excitement, and a lot of it is where people are quite stationary and continuing with a lot of experiments. A lot of the technical terms took me a long time to fathom out, I'm not going to lie. And there are a few bits where I can imagine, even I was sort of think, It's not a book for anybody who is sensitive about the treatment of animals, even though they are treated with a great deal of reverence. A lot of animals died so that they could do what they had to do. So, I think for many modern readers, they're going to be reading this thinking, what barbarians? But actually, in the times, it was nothing that out of the way. And the whole thing you really get from this, right up to the end, is that it's not the winning, it's not getting there first that matters, it's doing the work. And there is so much that we know about the Antarctic that we know because of this expedition, even though the final 5 men paid with their lives. And I do want to read more of journals from this particular expedition, but I think I'll have to wait a while until I can work up the nerve for it. So yeah, just absolutely amazing journey to go on with such a horribly sad ending. But just reinforces, I think, how some people really push for something that they want and something that's worthwhile. And that, even death, sometimes it doesn't stop the amazingness of what you've achieved. So good on you, Scott, and your team. And so looking into next year, I made a promise to myself as my New Year's resolution that I was not going to buy any more books until I'd finished what I'd read on my shelves at home, which probably isn't going to happen because I've already broken it twice. But I've kept mainly to it. But looking back on 2015, I think my aims for next year also have to be a bit more diverse. I think because I don't want to just be known as a history person. even though I do love it, but the thing is, with every new project I think of for myself comes research that inevitably seems to lead me back to the same places, and they are the places that I seem to be able to really excel at, getting into. I seem to be stuck in Victorian London a bit. But what I would also like to do is just to try and push myself a little bit more into other genres, because I think it can only be good. I don't want to be so bogged down in one that I'm denying myself sort of the pros of the others. I think unless you've kind of really jumped into a genre, sometimes you only see what you think you see. So, and I've also noticed from looking back, the majority of what I read last year was non-fiction, and it took me a bit by surprise, because I used to only ever read fiction, really, and I think obviously I'm very proud that I do now read non-fiction, because you just can't be without it. You can't get the sort of knowledge from fiction alone, and I think it's important, if you are, especially with history, that you do keep up your factual advice as well. You can't write good historical fiction without actually knowing the history. So I am very proud of myself, and it is a different kind of storytelling, narrative non-fiction. But I think what's probably happened somewhere along the line as well is that I've tried to avoid fiction that's going to trigger too many negative emotions, because of various reasons. I've wanted to kind of cut myself off a little bit from those. And even though, I mean, especially, that was pretty emotional, but it is slightly different. I mean, it doesn't quite do the job that fiction does. And I think that I'm probably faltering a little bit in stuff that I want to do, because I'm trying to avoid them. So, yeah, plans for next year to just keep on reading. I'm already well into my reading challenge, so I'm quite happy with what I'm making, and I'm already adding to it things that I didn't expect to. I was originally going to take a very strong line and plan everything, and I was going to do a fiction and non-fiction, fiction, non-fiction, but I think you can't do that. It just doesn't work, and if you're constantly sort of finding new things that you want, yes, so it's good. Now I've finally got a little bit of headroom on some of these. I can actually finish the reviews that I want to do, and then focus on this year and next year, and hopefully actually do a few projects of my own, if I manage the time, before being completely weighed down in research again. So yeah, it was a good reading year, 2015. So here's to the rest of 2016, and I'm sure it will be a success.